At one point, some people are like, what's going on with Antarctica? Have you heard this?
In 1979, at the edge of human exploration, a commercial airliner carrying 257 souls approached a realm where few dared to venture. Air New Zealand Flight 901 was about to pierce the veil between civilization and one of Earth's last true wildernesses.
Something seems to be going on this mysterious continent at the South Pole.
The frozen continent of Antarctica. But what began as an ambitious venture into polar tourism, where passengers traded champagne toast while gazing at pristine Antarctic vistas, would soon transform into one of aviation's most haunting mysteries. In a place where magnetic compasses spin uselessly and the white horizon merges seamlessly with the snow-covered ground, this sophisticated aircraft and its experienced crew would encounter nature's most perfect illusion, a deception that would lead them straight into the heart of Mount Erebus, changing aviation history forever. Antarctica calling, the seductive promise of polar tourism. In the late 1970s, Air New Zealand dared to transform what seemed impossible into an everyday luxury. Imagine boarding a commercial airliner in Auckland, champagne in hand, knowing that in just a few hours you'd be gazing upon landscapes that most humans would never see in their lifetime. This wasn't just another flight. It was an expedition that turned ordinary passengers into polar explorers, all while maintaining the comforts of a first-class cabin. The Antarctic sightseeing flights represented something profound in human ambition. Here was a continent that had claimed the lives of countless explorers, a place where Robert Falcon Scott and his team had perished in their quest for discovery, now made accessible to anyone with a ticket. Air New Zealand had achieved something remarkable. They had packaged the thrill of polar exploration into an 11-hour round trip that never required passengers to set foot on the treacherous continent below. The appeal was undeniable. Where else could you witness the raw power of Mount Erebus, a 12,000-foot active volcano rising from the Antarctic ice? Or see the endless expanse of McMurdo Sound, all while enjoying in-flight service? These flights quickly became one of the airline's most popular attractions, drawing curious adventurers from around the globe. Each flight promised spectacular views of the last true wilderness on Earth, complete with expert commentary from experienced guides who could explain the magnificent desolation unfolding beneath the wings. The success of these flights seemed to validate the entire concept. Flight after flight returned with awestruck passengers and rolls of film capturing otherworldly vistas. The operation ran smoothly enough that it began to feel routine, despite the extraordinary nature of each journey. Air New Zealand had seemingly mastered the art of making the impossible feel commonplace. But beneath this carefully crafted veneer of accessibility and safety, a complex web of challenges and risks was quietly taking shape, setting the stage for a tragedy that would shake New Zealand to its core. Flying to Antarctica was never as simple as following a straight line on a map. While modern passengers might be used to pilots navigating with pinpoint GPS accuracy, the harsh reality of polar flight in 1979 demanded a delicate dance with nature's most unforgiving elements. At these extreme latitudes, traditional navigation methods became increasingly unreliable. Magnetic compasses began to spin erratically as they approached the magnetic pole, and the vast white expanse below offered few distinguishing features for visual navigation. The route itself presented an illusion of simplicity that masked its true dangers. From the air, McMurdo Sound and Mount Erebus existed in a complex relationship of scale and perspective. What appeared as a clear path could transform into a deadly trap when the Antarctic weather decided to show its true nature. The original flight path had been meticulously planned to safely navigate these challenges, taking aircraft directly over Mount Erebus at a safe altitude that kept them well above its imposing peak. But then came the change that would alter everything, a seemingly insignificant coordinate adjustment that shifted the route by just 2 degrees, from 166 to 164 degrees. This minute alteration, made during a routine update to the aircraft's navigation computer in 1978, would prove to be catastrophically significant. The new coordinates effectively moved the program route from passing over Mount Erebus to crossing McMurdo Sound instead. The truly insidious nature of this change lay in its apparent logic. When pilots noticed they were flying over McMurdo Sound instead of Mount Erebus, Many simply assumed this was an intentional safety improvement. After all, flying over water seemed inherently safer than navigating around an active volcano. This reasonable but fatal assumption was reinforced by the fact that flying lower over the Sound would provide passengers with even more spectacular views of the Antarctic landscape. What made this situation particularly treacherous was how the new route transformed from a relatively straightforward path to a complex navigational puzzle. The shifted coordinates created an invisible trap where pilots' mental maps no longer matched their actual position in one of the world's most challenging flying environments. Yet because everything seemed to make perfect sense on paper, no one questioned the discrepancy until it was too late. As Air New Zealand Flight 901 prepared for departure on that fateful November morning, these hidden complexities were about to converge with a series of critical decisions that would test the limits of human judgment in the face of Antarctica's unforgiving nature. A perfect storm brewing. When experience meets the unexpected, the expertise of a pilot often lies not just in their flight hours, but in their intimate knowledge of specific routes. Captain Jim Collins and First Officer Gregory Mark Casson were undoubtedly skilled aviators, with impressive records and thousands of hours in the cockpit. Yet Antarctica demanded more than just general flying prowess. It required an almost instinctive understanding of its unique challenges. For these experienced pilots, this would be their first venture into one of Earth's most unforgiving territories. Their preparation for this extraordinary challenge consisted of just 45 minutes in a DC-10 flight simulator, a brief window focused primarily on basic navigation and instrument procedures. While this might have seemed adequate for a standard commercial route, Antarctica's unique combination of environmental challenges demanded far more specialized knowledge. The simulator could replicate instrument readings, but it couldn't prepare them for the disorienting effects of polar whiteout conditions or the split-second decisions required in rapidly changing Antarctic weather. Then came the critical shuffle of events just hours before departure. In the early hours of that November morning, at 1 o'clock, navigation officers made a crucial route adjustment, moving the flight path back over Mount Erebus. This change, prompted by another captain's earlier report about coordinate discrepancies, might have seemed like a routine correction in any other circumstance. But in the complex web of Antarctic aviation, it was akin to silently moving a lighthouse in the dead of night. The fatal thread in this tapestry of circumstances was the breakdown in communication. When Collins and Casson arrived for their pre-flight briefing, not a single word was mentioned about the route change. They prepared for their journey with the understanding that they would be flying over McMurdo Sound, continuing a practice that had become standard operating procedure for Antarctic sightseeing flights. This miscommunication wasn't just an oversight, it was the final piece in a perfect storm of circumstances that would prove catastrophic. The timing of these events created a deadly synchronicity. The late-night route change, the early morning departure, the new pilots to the route, and the limited specialized training, each element alone might have been manageable. But together they formed an invisible chain of vulnerability that would become apparent only when it was too late. As Flight 901 prepared for departure that morning, these behind-the-scenes complications were about to collide with weather conditions that would turn the Antarctic dream into a nightmare, setting in motion a sequence of events from which there would be no return. Dawn broke over Auckland with the promise of another routine Antarctic adventure. For the flight crew of 901, the morning began like any other, checking weather reports, reviewing flight plans, and preparing for what should have been another spectacular journey to the bottom of the world. Yet the weather reports coming in from McMurdo painted an increasingly complex picture of the challenges that lay ahead. The forecast handed to the flight crew spoke of seemingly manageable conditions: light winds, scattered snowfall, and an overcast layer hanging at around 3,500 feet. Nothing that would typically raise serious concerns for an experienced flight crew. As they proceeded with their preparations, additional reports from McMurdo's air traffic control refined this picture. The overcast layer had dropped to 2,000 feet, but they assured that visibility below this ceiling would remain adequate for sightseeing. The crew's reaction to these reports revealed the first hints of concern. The conditions didn't sound promising, yet they weren't severe enough to warrant cancellation. In what would later prove to be a pivotal decision, the McMurdo air traffic control team offered guidance that seemed to provide a solution. They suggested bringing the aircraft down to 1,500 feet once within 40 miles of the station. a suggestion that appeared to offer a way to navigate below the cloud cover and provide passengers with the views they had paid for. What followed was the development of a descent plan that, while technically sound for the route they thought they were flying, would prove catastrophically unsuitable for their actual path. The crew plotted a careful spiral descent from 18,000 feet, intending to drop below the cloud cover where they believed the relative safety of McMurdo Sound awaited them. This plan, though it violated the minimum safe altitude of 6,000 feet, was a common practice for Antarctic sightseeing flights seeking to provide optimal viewing experiences. As Flight 901 began its final approach towards what the crew believed was McMurdo Sound, they were about to encounter weather conditions that would transform their carefully planned descent into a desperate race against time. Into the white void, the final minutes of Flight 901. The descent began with the quiet confidence of experienced aviators navigating familiar skies. Flight 901 started its careful spiral down from 18,000 feet, piercing through layers of Antarctic clouds that seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. Inside the cockpit, Captain Collins and First Officer Casson maintained their professional composure, even as the white void outside their windows began to erase every reference point they relied upon. As they descended through the cloud layer, they encountered a phenomenon that has haunted Antarctic aviators since the dawn of polar flight: the sector whiteout. This wasn't simply poor visibility or challenging weather. It was nature's perfect illusion. Imagine trying to navigate through a world where the white expanse of snow below perfectly merges with the overcast sky above, creating a seamless void where depth perception becomes impossible. No shadows, no horizon, no visual cues to distinguish up from down, near from far. It was like flying inside a pearl, where every direction offered the same featureless white canvas. The crew's radio communications with McMurdo Station began to deteriorate, creating an eerie isolation in one of Earth's most remote locations. Their voices crackled through the static, each transmission becoming more fragmented than the last, until finally the silence became complete. They were now alone with their instruments, their training, and their assumptions about where they were in relation to the Antarctic landscape. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The flight engineers' concern became palpable as they continued to fly through conditions that matched nothing in their pre-flight briefing. What should have been a clear view of McMurdo Sound's flat expanse remained stubbornly hidden behind the impenetrable white void. The tension peaked when the engineer voiced the question that had begun nagging at all of them. Where exactly was Mount Erebus in relation to their position? The sightseeing guide, Peter, attempted to provide reassurance, suggesting the mountain lay 25 miles to their left. But in Antarctica's white void, distance and direction had become dangerously unreliable concepts. Captain Collins acknowledged the deteriorating conditions, his voice betraying the growing uncertainty that had begun to grip the flight deck. First Officer Casson suggested a right turn, a 180-degree escape route from the situation. But in that crucial moment, the decision was made to press forward. The crew's professional dialogue in these final minutes revealed the insidious nature of the sector whiteout, how it could make experienced pilots doubt their own perceptions while simultaneously masking the urgency of their situation. They were in reality flying directly toward the slopes of Mount Erebus, but the perfect white void offered no visual warning of the impending disaster. In the next few moments, this disorienting dance through Antarctica's white void would transform into a desperate race against time, as the mountain they thought was miles away suddenly announced its presence with a warning that came far too late. The growing uncertainty in the cockpit had transformed from whispered concern to vocal apprehension. The flight engineers' instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. The endless white void outside their windows contradicted everything they expected to see. The featureless expanse that should have been McMurdo Sound stretched before them, offering no clue that they were flying straight toward disaster. In these crucial moments, the cockpit voice recorder captured the rising tension through fragments of professional dialogue that would later haunt aviation investigators. A question about Mount Erebus's position hung in the air, met with uncertain responses and growing confusion. The sightseeing guide's assumption that the mountain lay 25 miles to their left seemed reassuring, but in Antarctica's deceptive white void, such estimates held deadly uncertainty. First Officer Cassin's suggestion cut through the tension. A right turn, an escape route from the deteriorating situation. His words carried the weight of growing concern. There would be nothing in their path if they chose to turn around. But Captain Collins, still believing they were safely over McMurdo Sound, made the fateful decision to continue forward. It was a choice made with professional judgment, yet one based on a tragic misunderstanding of their true position. Then came the sound that every pilot dreads, the sharp, urgent beep of the ground proximity warning system. Its mechanical voice broke through the cockpit's tension, announcing their perilous position just 500 feet above terrain. But in the cruel mathematics of physics and fate, 6 seconds wasn't enough time to alter the course of a fully loaded DC-10 traveling at 404 kilometers per hour. At 12:50 in the afternoon, just 5 minutes after their last radio contact with McMurdo Station, Air New Zealand Flight 901 crashed into the slopes of Mount Erebus. The impact was catastrophic and instantaneous. All 257 souls aboard passengers who had embarked on what they thought would be the adventure of a lifetime were lost in a moment that would forever change aviation history. In the aftermath of the crash, as the Antarctic winds howled across the impact site, a new chapter would begin, one that would challenge New Zealand's national consciousness and spark one of the most controversial investigations in aviation history. Operation Overdue: Heroes in the Shadow of Erebus. The morning after the crash, Antarctica's harsh reality presented itself in full force to the recovery teams. As the U.S. Navy dispatched their initial search efforts, they discovered a scene that would challenge even the most seasoned emergency responders. The wreckage lay scattered across Mount Erebus's unforgiving slopes, spread over an area 570 meters by 120 meters. A frozen tableau of tragedy that demanded an unprecedented recovery effort. Operation Overdue would become one of the most challenging recovery missions in aviation history. The team faced not just the technical complexities of working in extreme conditions, but also the emotional weight of their grim task. Police officers, dentists, pathologists, and other specialists found themselves setting up camp in one of Earth's most hostile environments, their polar tents pitched amidst wreckage and human remains, while temperatures plummeted and bitter winds howled around them. Jim Morgan, who led the mortuary team, would later describe scenes that tested the limits of human endurance. His team worked tirelessly in the shadow of Mount Erebus, their efforts constantly hampered by the continent's merciless conditions. The recovery teams battled not just the cold and wind, but also an unexpected adversary, skua gulls that descended upon the crash site, forcing the workers into a heartbreaking race against time and nature itself. Psychological toll on these recovery workers was immense. They spent weeks living in primitive conditions, surrounded by the aftermath of tragedy, while the Antarctic environment seemed determined to thwart their every effort. The skua's persistent attempts to interfere with their work added a particularly distressing dimension to an already challenging mission. Morgan and his colleagues found themselves in the impossible position of trying to preserve dignity for the deceased while fending off nature's brutal indifference. Yet despite these overwhelming odds, the recovery team's dedication proved remarkable. Their exhaustive efforts resulted in the recovery of 83% of the victims' remains, an extraordinary achievement given the hostile conditions and the scale of the disaster. Each identification represented not just a technical accomplishment, but a small measure of closure for waiting families back in New Zealand. The Queen of New Zealand would later recognize their extraordinary service with the Medal of Special Service, but perhaps the true measure of their achievement lay in the gratitude of hundreds of grieving families who could finally lay their loved ones to rest. These men and women had ventured into one of Earth's most inhospitable environments and returned with answers for those left behind. As the recovery teams completed their solemn duty on Mount Erebus, another challenge was just beginning, an investigation that would spark controversy and reveal deep-seated issues within New Zealand's aviation system. From investigation to legacy, the ripples of an Antarctic tragedy. In the wake of the disaster, New Zealand's Chief Inspector of Air Accidents, Ron Chippendale, faced the daunting task of explaining how a routine sightseeing flight had ended in catastrophe. His official report landed squarely on pilot error, building its case on 3 fundamental points: the crew's decision to descend below minimum safe altitude, their uncertainty about their position, and the assertion that the coordinate change hadn't actually misled them. This explanation might have stood unchallenged in many other circumstances, but the magnitude of the tragedy demanded deeper scrutiny. Enter Justice Peter Mahone, appointed by the government to conduct a more thorough investigation. What he uncovered would shake New Zealand's aviation establishment to its core. His investigation revealed a troubling pattern of institutional failures, from the mishandled coordinate change to the critical breakdown in communication about the route modification. Most damning was the revelation that flight crews had never been properly warned about the dangers of Antarctic whiteout conditions. Mahone's investigation culminated in what would become one of aviation history's most memorable phrases, an orchestrated litany of lies. His accusation that the airline had attempted to cover up crucial evidence sent shockwaves through New Zealand society. When Air New Zealand challenged these findings in court, the High Court found themselves in an uncomfortable position. While they couldn't dispute Mahone's core findings about airline error, they ruled he had exceeded his jurisdiction. Mahone's subsequent resignation spoke volumes about the depth of his convictions. The legacy of Flight 901 reaches far beyond the courtroom drama. It fundamentally transformed how airlines approach polar flights, leading to stringent new protocols for navigation in extreme environments. The tragedy forced a reevaluation of how airlines communicate critical route changes and highlighted the importance of comprehensive weather phenomenon training. Perhaps most significantly, it changed how the aviation industry views the relationship between commercial interests and natural barriers. New Zealand's relationship with Antarctica was forever altered. The continent they once viewed as their backyard had extracted a terrible price for underestimating its dangers. Yet from this tragedy emerged a deeper respect for Antarctic aviation, with new generations of pilots and airlines approaching the continent with hard-learned humility and significantly enhanced safety measures. The lessons written in the ice of Mount Erebus continue to influence aviation safety today, a testament to the 257 souls who unknowingly changed the future of polar flight forever. Air New Zealand began their Antarctic sightseeing flights. They sought to make Earth's final frontier accessible to everyday adventurers. The passengers of Flight 901 embarked on what should have been the journey of a lifetime, their spirits buoyed by the promise of champagne and breathtaking views. Instead, they became part of a profound lesson in the respect Antarctica demands. Their legacy lives on in the sweeping changes to aviation safety that followed it, changes that continue to protect millions of passengers today. In their quest for adventure, they unknowingly help make the skies safer for generations to come.